Designation 7 had a reputation in the interstellar cooperative, and that reputation was absolutely not worth your time, your money, or your life expectancy. 14 species had attempted colonization over the past 2 centuries. 14 species had packed up their prefabricated habitat modules and retreated with their wounded pride and actual wounded colonists. 3 hadn't bothered with the retreat part, leaving behind mass graves and strongly worded reports about extreme environmental hostility. The planet itself seemed personally offended by the concept of intelligent life. Every 72 hours, like clockwork, acid rain would sweep across the continents with the enthusiasm of a particularly aggressive cleaning product. The gravity fluctuated, not dramatically enough to be predictable, but just enough to make your inner ear question every life choice that brought you to this moment. The flora had evolved what xenobotanists politely termed proactive defense mechanisms, which was academic speak for the plants will absolutely try to eat you. Temperature swings ran from pleasant autumn morning to the inside of a furnace within 6-hour cycles. The soil composition read like someone had dumped a chemical warfare facility into a toxic waste dump and then somehow made it worse. The Vrin had tried first, because the Vrin tried everything first. They arrived with atmospheric processes, terraforming equipment, and the kind of confidence that came from successfully colonizing 47 other worlds. They lasted 8 months before their lead engineer sent a 5-word report. Everything here hates us specifically. The Kolari attempted a floating city approach, reasoning that if they didn't touch the ground couldn't kill them. The acid rain dissolved their anti-corrosion coating in 3 weeks. Turns out the ground didn't need to kill them when the sky was perfectly willing to do the job. The Thexians brought force fields. The force fields failed when the local insects discovered they could short-circuit the generators by building nests in the power conduits. The Morphali tried underground colonies, which worked brilliantly until they discovered the planet had seismic activity that followed no logical pattern and occurred exclusively under foreign structures. The Zereth attempted genetic modification of local flora to make it less hostile, which resulted in super-aggressive plants that were now also resistant to their herbicides. That particular disaster required orbital bombardment to contain, and the cooperative was still receiving therapy bills from the Zereth Diplomatic Corps. The reports piled up in the cooperative's archives, each one a variation on the same theme. Designation 7 was a monument to failure, a cosmic middle finger to the very concept of colonization. The planet had cost various governments approximately 40 billion credits in failed infrastructure, not counting the lawsuits from surviving colonists who returned with exotic new phobias and respiratory conditions. And yet the planet had resources, mineral deposits that made geologists weep with joy. Potential agricultural zones, if one could survive long enough to plant anything. Strategic location along 3 major trade routes. Water sources that were abundant, if you could figure out how to not die from touching them. On paper, Designation 7 was prime real estate. In practice, it was a graveyard with excellent curb appeal and a property value that decreased with every corpse. The Interstellar Cooperative emergency session convened on a Tuesday, which should have been everyone's first warning that things were going poorly. Nobody scheduled emergency sessions on Tuesdays unless the situation had progressed from concerning to we've run out of other options, and also possibly our minds. Administrator Kelthon of the Vrin delegation brought up the Designation 7 file with the weariness of someone who'd been forced to confront their species' most expensive mistake. His scales had dulled to the color of bureaucratic defeat. The Terthan Union just abandoned their 4th attempt. That brings our collective failure count to 19 separate colonization initiatives. 19. Councillor Vexnari's antenna twitched with what might have been amusement or horror. With the Kolari it was hard to tell. I thought we stopped at 14. 5 weren't officially sanctioned, private ventures by idiots with more credits than survival instincts. And they also failed, spectacularly. One group lasted 11 days. The leader's final log entry was just screaming. Not words, just screaming for 47 seconds before the transmission cut out. What happened to them? We sent a recovery team. They found the colony site but no bodies. The local ecosystem had recycled them with impressive efficiency. The council chamber filled with the uncomfortable silence of beings collectively wondering why they bothered with expansionism when the universe kept presenting them with planets like this. Someone's translator made a sound like a sigh crossed with a wheeze crossed with the death rattle of optimism. We've invested too much to simply write off designation 7, Kelthon continued, pulling up financial projections that made several council members physically recoil. The resources alone would justify. Justify what? Vexnari interrupted. Justify a 20th failed colony. Another mass grave. Another line item in the terrible decisions budget. At what point do we accept that some planets are simply incompatible with colonization? The Terthan Union paid 17 billion credits for settlement rights. They're demanding refunds. They knew the risks. They're threatening legal action. Something about misrepresentation of habitability potential. The planet killed 18 previous colonies. How is that misrepresentation? Kelthon's scales flushed darker. Their lawyers are very creative. The point is, we need a solution or we need to officially declare designation 7 as permanently uncolonizable, which would trigger refund clauses in 47 separate contracts and probably bankrupt the Colonial Development Fund. I'm open to suggestions that don't involve bankruptcy or mass death. Junior analyst Plenick, who really should have learned to keep quiet during important meetings, raised a tentacle. The appendage wavered uncertainly in the air like it regretted the decision even as it committed to the gesture. What about the humans? The silence that followed carried the weight of several thousand years of collective galactic experience watching humans do inadvisable things and somehow survive them. It was the silence of beings who'd seen humans invent warp drives by accident, tame predators for companionship, and considered jumping out of aircraft for entertainment a reasonable hobby. The humans, Kelthon repeated slowly, as if testing the words for hidden traps, who thought glass cockpits in spacecraft were a good idea. They also invented the Shaw Fujikawa drive by accident while trying to make a better beverage cooler. Plenick pointed out, his confidence growing marginally. They're unconventional. They're chaotic. Yes, but productively chaotic. They colonized their own planet's ocean floors before they developed proper space travel. They live in deserts, tundras, and active volcanic regions voluntarily. Their definition of habitable is significantly broader than ours. Vexnari made a sound like air escaping from a deflating balloon. We're seriously considering asking the species that hunts for entertainment, keeps predators as domestic companions, and invented extreme sports to tackle our most hostile planet. Do we have better options? Plenick gestured at the file of failed colonies. 19 attempts. 19 failures. Maybe the problem isn't the planet. Maybe the problem is that we're all approaching it the same way. And the humans would approach it differently. The humans approach everything differently. It's their defining characteristic. Remember the Kelfor crisis. Every species sent military fleets. The humans sent negotiators with food and alcohol. Somehow it worked. That was luck. They call it creative problem solving. And right now we need creativity more than we need another conventional failure. Nobody answered, which was an answer in itself. The kind of answer that came from desperation meeting curiosity and deciding they might as well dance together since the alternative was admitting defeat. 3 weeks later, Marcus Webb sat across from a panel of alien bureaucrats who looked at him the way one might examine a particularly confusing modern art installation. His file lay open on the table between them, a document that charted a career best described as enthusiastically mediocre. Your qualifications are... Kelthon scrolled through the data pad, searching for something diplomatic to say while his scales shifted through colors that suggested deep uncertainty. Interesting. Marcus grinned. He had the kind of grin that suggested he'd heard this before and found it amusing rather than insulting. That's usually code for not impressive, but I appreciate the effort at diplomacy. You've never successfully completed a class A terraforming project. True. But I've also never had a colony die on me, which according to your designation 7 statistics puts me ahead of 19 other attempts. Sometimes not failing is its own kind of success. Vexnari leaned forward, antenna tilting in what Marcus had learned was the Kolari equivalent of intense scrutiny. You understand what you're proposing? This planet has killed professional colonization teams multiple times. Teams with better equipment, more funding, and frankly better resumes than yours. I read the reports, all of them, including the classified ones that someone definitely shouldn't have leaked to the public database but did anyway. And you still want to go? I read the reports, Marcus repeated, leaning forward with the enthusiasm of someone about to explain their pet theory, and I noticed something interesting. Every single failed colony tried to impose their solution on the planet. Atmospheric processes to change the air, gravity stabilizers to change the physics, chemical soil treatment to change the ground, force fields to keep the environment out, underground bunkers to hide from it. Everyone showed up with a plan to change the planet into something it wasn't. He spread his hands. Nobody tried working with what was already there, because what's already there is actively trying to kill you, Kelthon said flatly. Or, Marcus countered, it's a functioning ecosystem that doesn't appreciate foreign interference. Look, you've got acid rain every 3 days. That's predictable. Regular schedule, you could set your watch by it if you still used watches. Temperature swings on 6-hour cycles. Also predictable, the gravity fluctuations follow the tidal patterns of those 3 moons. I checked the orbital mechanics. Even the aggressive plants are just defending their territory. That's not chaos. That's order. Different order than you're used to, sure, but order nonetheless. Everything on designation 7 makes sense if you stop treating it like a broken planet that needs fixing and start treating it like a different kind of planet that needs understanding. Kelthon and Vexnari exchanged glances that communicated volumes of unspoken bureaucratic concern. You're either brilliant or suicidal, Vexnari said carefully. Why not both? Marcus stood up, radiating the kind of confidence that either came from deep knowledge or complete ignorance. In his case, possibly both. Give me 6 months. Minimal equipment. No crew. They'd just argue with my methods. Just me, some basic supplies, and authorization to work with local materials. If I'm dead in 6 months, you're out 1 mediocre terraformer and some supply costs. If I'm not dead, maybe we learn something useful. If I actually succeed, you've got your colony solution and bragging rights. This is insane, Kelthon muttered, but he was already pulling up contract forms. Probably, but you're out of sane options, And insanity is just another word for trying something nobody else was brave or stupid enough to attempt. Do we have a deal? They gave him the contract because they'd run out of sane options, and sometimes insanity was just another word for innovation that hadn't been vindicated yet. Marcus arrived on Designation 7 on a Thursday, which he decided was a good omen because nothing truly terrible ever happened on Thursdays. Historical evidence suggested otherwise, but optimism was a survival trait, and Marcus had optimism in abundance. The landing shuttle dropped him off with 3 cargo containers of supplies, a prefab shelter that would probably last a month before the environment disassembled it, and a communications array that linked him to the orbital monitoring station where a rotating crew of alien observers would watch him either succeed or die. The betting pools currently favored death at 3-to-1 odds. The first thing he did was go for a walk. The monitoring station's log entry for Day 1 read, "Human subject departed landing zone at 0800 hours. Has been walking in seemingly random patterns for 6 hours. Stopped occasionally to examine plants and soil. Collected samples. Appears to be talking to himself. Psychological evaluation may be necessary. Betting pool adding death by confusions as new category." Marcus wasn't talking to himself. He was talking to the planet, which he understood was functionally the same thing but felt more productive. "Okay, so you've got these beautiful drainage patterns in the rock formations. Natural channels carved over however many thousand years. Geological poetry. And these plants here cluster around the mineral deposits, which means they've figured out how to process the heavy metals in the soil. You're not broken. You're not hostile. You're just specific. You've got rules. I can work with rules." Day 2's log. Human subject spent entire day mapping water flow patterns during acid rain cycle. Did not use shelter. Instead constructed crude drainage channels around landing site using local stones. Erected temporary cover using equipment tarp and local wood. Shelter remained completely dry. How did he know where to put the channels? Reviewing geological survey data. Human apparently read all 14,000 pages. Who reads all 14,000 pages? Day 5. Subject has begun moving supplies to new location approximately 2 kilometers from landing site. Location makes no logical sense. Exposed hillside. No natural shelter. Prevailing winds would hammer any structure. Monitoring team questions decision-making capacity. Betting pool odds shifting to death by exposures at 2-to-1. Day 7. Hillside location now makes sense. Subject position site in gravity-stable zone where 3 tidal patterns cancel each other out. Gravity fluctuation minimal to non-existent. Also position site in wind shadow created by valley formation during temperature cycle storms. Retract previous assessment of decision-making capacity. Human appears to understand planetary mechanics better than our survey teams. Betting pool in chaos. Several team members requesting data on human educational background. Day 10. Subject encountered aggressive flora today. Instead of using weapons or retreating, subject observed plant behavior for 3 hours. Concluded plant responds to movement and chemical signals. Subject now walks specific paths around plant territory. Plant ignores subject. This shouldn't work. Xenobotany team demanding footage. Marcus worked from dawn until the temperature swings made labor impossible, then rested during the hot cycles and planned during the cool ones. His approach was simple in concept, complex in execution. Observe, understand, adapt, cooperate. He built stone paths that followed the natural drainage patterns, creating a network that channeled acid rain away from his work areas and into collection basins where it could be neutralized with local limestone deposits he'd discovered in a canyon system. The limestone reacted with the acid to produce usable water and useful mineral byproducts that turned out to make excellent fertilizer. He identified plants that thrived in specific conditions and cultivated them as natural barriers against the more aggressive flora. The predatory plants he discovered were territorial. They didn't attack if you respected their space and didn't smell like prey. Not smelling like prey involved a lot of trial and error, and one incident he preferred not to discuss, but it boiled down to avoiding areas after handling certain minerals and always approaching from downwind. The prefab shelter lasted exactly 32 days before the environment reduced it to expensive debris. Marcus had already built a stone cottage using local materials positioned in a microclimate pocket where temperature swings were minimal. The roof design channeled rain into storage and the walls were thick enough to maintain comfortable temperatures. It wasn't fancy, but it didn't try to fight the planet, which meant the planet didn't fight back. By week 6, the monitoring station's logs had changed in tone. Subject has established thriving garden using raised bed technique. Plants appear to be hybrid approach, native species grafted with food crops from supply stock. Acid rain irrigation system functioning perfectly. Gardens positioned to receive optimal sunlight during cool cycles, shaded during hot cycles. This shouldn't work. It's working. Xenobotany team has submitted formal request to visit site. Subject constructed greenhouse using local glass-like mineral deposits. Temperature regulation achieved through passive ventilation system that exploits natural convection patterns. No powered climate control required. Energy consumption minimal. Structure survived yesterday's temperature spike that would have destroyed standard habitat module. Request detailed plans for review and possible integration into colonial design standards. Subject has mapped entire valley system, created walking paths that connect multiple microclimate zones. Each zone optimized for different purposes: agriculture, rest, resource gathering, water collection. The paths themselves are positioned to provide shelter during temperature extremes. Trees planted along southern exposure create windbreaks. This is remarkable. This is impossible. This is happening anyway. Betting pool closed. Everyone lost. Human survival no longer in question. Month 3 brought the storm. The monitoring station detected it 6 hours out. A massive weather system that had destroyed 2 previous colonies outright. Wind speeds approaching 200 kilometers per hour. Acid rain at triple normal concentration. Electrical activity that made sensor equipment scream warnings. The storm system had a name in the colonial records: the Valley Killer. It appeared every 18 months with meteorological punctuality. Human subject, you need to evacuate to the landing site immediately. The station commander transmitted, voice tight with concern. Shuttle can extract you in 40 minutes. This is not optional. This storm is categorized as extinction level for ground settlements. Marcus stood on his cottage porch, watching the dark clouds roll across the horizon like an invading army. He was drinking tea. Actual tea from plants he'd grown, served in a cup he'd made from local clay. I'm good here, thanks. This storm will kill you. It has killed others. We have documented evidence. This storm is going to water my gardens. Have you lost your mind? Probably lost it somewhere around week 2. Stand by. I want you to record this. Record your death. Record the storm management system functioning as designed. If this works, you'll want the data. If it doesn't work, you'll want the data on what not to do. Either way, science wins. The storm hit like the universe had personal grievances and a list of targets. Wind tore across the valley with vindictive force, screaming through the rock formations with sounds that made the monitoring station crew physically uncomfortable. Rain hammered down in sheets of corrosive fury that dissolved exposed metal and pitted stone.
Lightning turned the sky into a violent light show. The monitoring station lost visual contact and waited for confirmation of another dead human who'd pushed his luck too far. 3 hours later, the storm passed. The monitoring station re-established visual contact and found Marcus's settlement not only intact but thriving in ways that defied their understanding of survivable weather events. Every path had channeled water exactly where it needed to go. The drainage systems had prevented flooding while capturing usable water. The stone structures had shed rain without damage, their sloped roofs and strategic overhangs designed to work with the wind rather than against it. The gardens, protected by strategic windbreaks and covered channels, had received perfect irrigation. New growth was already visible. Seeds that had been dormant in the soil were sprouting in response to the moisture. Marcus waved at the nearest camera and went back to harvesting vegetables, completely unbothered by the fact that he'd just survived what 3 alien species had officially classified as unsurvivable weather conditions. The monitoring station commander sent a one-word report to the Interstellar Cooperative. Impossible. The response came back in 2 words: explain immediately. 6 months after arrival, Marcus sent a formal invitation to the council to visit Designation 7 for an inspection tour. The message was professional, detailed, and included a menu for the lunch he planned to serve, featuring items grown entirely on planet. The postscript read, "Bring cameras. You'll want documentation." They arrived expecting a madman in ruins or a corpse with ambitions. The shuttle descended through atmosphere that the pilot described as surprisingly stable for this hellhole, which was the nicest thing anyone had said about Designation 7's weather in recorded history. The valley came into view, and the shuttle went silent. Stone cottages with sloped roofs clustered around a central garden area, positioned with obvious geometric purpose. Walking paths wound through the settlement like arteries, each one positioned with mathematical precision. Garden beds overflowed with produce in shades of green and gold and purple. Fruit trees grew in protected groves, their branches heavy with developing fruit. A small vineyard occupied a south-facing slope, the vines climbing support structures made from local wood. Flowers bloomed in window boxes, actual flowers. On Designation 7, the planet of death had flowers in window boxes. Marcus met them at the landing pad wearing dirt-stained work clothes and carrying a basket of vegetables that included 3 varieties nobody recognized. "Welcome to New Haven," he said, grinning like someone who'd just won an argument with the universe. "I made tea. It's fresh mint from the garden. Please don't look too shocked, it makes me self-conscious about my agricultural achievements." The tour lasted 2 hours and fundamentally altered everyone's understanding of possible. Marcus walked them through his entire operation, explaining each decision with the casual confidence of someone who'd stopped questioning whether the impossible was possible, and simply made it happen through observation and stubbornness. The paths follow natural drainage and wind patterns. During acid rain, their channels. During storm, their shelters. Walk along them during temperature spikes and you're always in shade. The stone comes from those quarries, easy to work with, weather resistant, and the planet's already broken it down to manageable sizes through natural erosion. No heavy processing needed. He pointed to the gardens with obvious pride. Raised beds using treated native soil. The local plants taught me which minerals to balance. That aggressive vine everyone's afraid of. Excellent pest control if you convince it you're not food. You convince it by respecting its territory and not carrying the chemical signatures of its natural prey. The temperature swings are predictable, so the cottages are positioned in stable zones with thermal mass walls that moderate interior conditions. The gravity fluctuations don't affect the valley floor because of those 3 moons cancelling each other out. Everything here works because I asked the planet what it needed instead of telling it what I needed.
Kelthon examined a garden bed like it might be a hallucination induced by toxic spores. This violates everything we know about hostile environment colonization. It violates everything you tried, Marcus corrected gently. You tried to impose solutions from successful colonies on other planets. You brought techniques that worked elsewhere and wondered why they failed here. I tried cooperation, observation, adaptation. Turns out planets respond better to negotiation than ultimatums, even if the negotiation is one-sided and involves a lot of me talking to plants. Vexnari studied the cottage construction, running scanners over the stonework with increasing fascination. This should have taken a team of engineers months to design. Structural analysis alone would require, you did this alone in 6 months. I had excellent consultants. The planet showed me what worked. I just listened and took notes and tried things until they functioned correctly. Marcus poured tea into cups he'd made from local clay, fired in a kiln built from valley stone. Look, your previous colonies failed because they treated this place like a problem to solve with technology and force. It's not a problem, it's just different. Different rules, different approaches, different results. Humans are good at adaptation. We spent most of our evolutionary history figuring out how to survive places that wanted us dead. Ice ages, deserts, swamps, mountains. We lived in all of them before we invented climate control. This is just another Tuesday for us, just another environment that requires observation and respect instead of conquest. The council members drank tea in a garden on a planet that had killed 19 colonization attempts, and tried to reconcile their understanding of the universe with the evidence growing around them in defiance of possibility. Other humans are going to want to come here, Kelthon said finally, his scales shifting to colors that suggested grudging respect. If this works, and against all rational assessment and previous evidence, it appears to work, this becomes a viable colony. Marcus nodded, pulling out actual paper maps covered in detailed notes and drawings. I've got plans drawn up. Positions marked for 50 initial structures using the microclimate zones I've identified. Agricultural zones mapped with crop rotation schedules that work with the acid rain cycles. Resource management protocols that treat the planet as a partner ecosystem rather than a resource to be exploited. Everything scales up while maintaining the cooperative approach. You work with the planet works with you. Simple. Nothing about this is simple. Sure it is. You just have to stop being afraid of doing things differently. Stop assuming that the way things worked on your homeworld or your previous successful colonies is the only way things can work. Be willing to observe, adapt, and occasionally talk to plants like they're intelligent design solutions because functionally they are. 6 months later, New Haven had a population of 200. Humans arrived with families, equipment, and the peculiar optimism that characterized their species' approach to hostile environments. They built homes using Marcus's techniques, cultivated gardens following his models, and established a settlement that thrived through cooperation rather than conquest. Children played in gardens that previous species had declared death zones. Families harvested vegetables during acid rain cycles, protected by drainage systems that turned hazard into resource. The Interstellar Cooperative added another entry to their growing file labeled Human Unpredictability Case Studies. The file was becoming uncomfortably thick and required its own dedicated archive section. Designation 7 was officially renamed New Haven in colonial records, though monitoring station personnel still called it Webb's Folly when they thought no humans were listening, though the name had shifted from mockery to affection. The planet that had symbolized the limits of colonization became a training ground for adaptive settlement techniques. Universities sent xenoecology students to study the integration approaches. The settlement that shouldn't exist became proof that existence was negotiable if you approached it with observation instead of assumption. Marcus Webb, the mediocre terraformer with the unremarkable resume, received official recognition from the cooperative, including medals, speaking invitations, and consulting contracts. He politely declined most of them. He preferred his garden on New Haven, where the acid rain came precisely every 72 hours and watered his vegetables with predictable efficiency, where the temperature swings created perfect baking conditions in his stone oven during the hot cycles, and where the supposedly hostile planet had become something much more interesting. Home. The universe, it turned out, wasn't divided into habitable and uninhabitable worlds. It was divided into worlds where species imposed their will and worlds where species learned to listen. The difference between success and failure wasn't technology or funding or expertise or superior engineering. It was asking the planet what it wanted instead of telling it what you needed. And maybe, just maybe, having the peculiar human audacity to treat an impossible situation as simply another problem that hadn't met the right kind of stubborn yet. The kind of stubborn that built paths where others saw obstacles, planted gardens where others saw death, and created homes where the universe had clearly marked a warning sign. The kind of stubborn that looked at 19 failures and said, "I can do this differently." The kind of stubborn that only humans seemed to possess in sufficient quantities to make the impossible merely improbable, and the improbable merely a matter of time and observation. New Haven thrived. The planet stopped killing visitors and started accommodating them. And somewhere in the galactic databases, next to the expensive failures and the lessons learned, a new entry appeared. When conventional approaches fail, try asking a human. Results may vary. Success rate inexplicably high. Recommend maintaining supplies of tea and tolerance for unconventional thinking.